Welcome back. This video is pretty much a guide for everything that you need to know for realistic space combat and spaceships. And when I say realistic, I mostly mean stuff that looks like it's near future level of tech and also not using quantum rudders. So the first part of this video will be about the combat. The second part of this video will be about the aesthetics. For the combat, the first and foremost thing that anyone has to understand is that it is not dogfighting. Dogfighting with aircraft is very, very different, and most, if not all of it, does not apply to space combat when you're not using quantum rudders. If you need some form of analogy to wrap your head around how to do space combat better and more efficiently, I recommend thinking of it more as a helicopter fight, where you can move anywhere and you can sit still if you want, and you just try to get your nose on target and blast them, and that's about it. Unlike whereas a plane, you're trying to get onto their tail, and you have to do stuff like energy management, and you have to care about your velocity, and you can't stop without stalling. Which is why there are three main parts to warship combat. To realistic space combat. I don't actually have any space fighters, I only have space warships, which handle a little bit differently since they don't really have the same amount of reverse thrusters. So that's why the footage you're seeing looks a little bit different from what I'm going to be describing, but yeah. So there's three main parts: keeping your weapon on target, positioning for the optimal firing window, and denying your enemy the optimal firing window. So, because you're in space, you cannot stall, you can never fall out of the sky, and because of that, and because there's no air resistance of any sort, there should be absolutely no reasons why your nose is not pointed towards the enemy at all times. If your nose is not pointed towards the enemy, then that's just worse. There is no reason to not just shoot the enemy. In space, you can fly backwards, you can fly forwards, you can fly side to side. So the direction in which you're moving does not have to be linked to the direction in which you're facing and therefore shooting. Or, for example, on these warships, they have their own turrets, but they lack reverse thrusters. So you can still separate the direction of movement from the direction you're shooting. It's just hard for me since I was the only person using this warship. So trying to manage all the controls was difficult for me personally, but space fighters, because they're smaller and simpler, don't really have that issue. So again, first, most important point for realistic space combat, you should always be pointing towards your enemy. The second point is positioning yourself for the best firing position. Basically, depending on what weapons you have, what things the enemy has, and your maneuverability, you want to set yourself up to get the most amounts of damage. So if you have lasers, that means you could probably hang back at the very edge of the auto-aim range and still get very good damage, because lasers are faster and more accurate. If you have something like rockets, you probably just want to get in close for a moment, deploy all the rockets, and then get as far away as possible so that they don't have time to counterattack. And that leads into the second point, denying the enemy the ability to get good shots off of you. Specifically, by exiting and entering. So if you have a weapon that has high DPS, which is sustained damage, you should probably stay inside of the attacking zone for as long as possible. If you have weapons like rockets or cannons that have a long reload and therefore very high burst damage but very low sustained damage, at that point I recommend quickly going in, hitting them, and then leaving. And then there's dodging. Dodging, you really just want to have strafe controls, but a lot of the time strafe controls take too much mental energy. So a lot of the time you're going to want to automate that. For example, here's an example of automated strafe dodging. This is really all you need, just having thrusters firing in a sequence, and this is enough to throw off auto aim by a good amount. You don't need something super complex, just a sequence of thrusters firing back and forth. And that's, again, all you need. So the result of these things is, instead of boom and zoom and turn fighting, you end up with these two other forms of fighting, which can be loosely called the same thing. Orbit fighting, where the two enemies, you and the enemy, try to stay as close together as possible and try to match each other's velocity. So this is where I have to note something. Warships, because they're a lot bigger, they have a lot less space on the front for backwards pointing thrusters. That's why they have turrets, so that if they want to slow down, the entire warship can just spin around and then use the main engines, and then the turrets can just follow the target. However, as you can see in this combat footage behind, the being played as I'm speaking, I didn't really have that option because, again, I was not able to fully manage the turret systems as well as the piloting as well as the other details. So because of that, I'm kind of piloting this without reverse thrusters. So, which is why you'll see me have a very hard time trying to match velocities. Even on the warships that should be kind of good at it, I just don't have the brain power while also trying to, predict where the enemy's going and try to go in that direction as well. And then there's jousting, which is what happens more often in the videos playing behind, because again, without reverse thrusters, because big warships are very heavy, so you kind of need to consolidate all your thrust into a singular main drive section. Jousting is what happens when you accelerate towards your enemy and then you don't slow down. You just keep accelerating. So what this does is gives you a very, very, very short intercept window, a very short gap where you can actually shoot the enemy and the enemy can shoot you, which is very good for burst damage at the cost of being very hard to properly aim at the target and properly hit. But it is oftentimes the optimal strategy depending on the weapons that you have. And again, this is mostly what happens in the video, as you can see here, because, for the reasons I've just explained, the thrusters have to be consolidated to the back to give more power. But that also means that I can't easily reverse, which is why you'll see me skip by the enemy pretty often. And that's really most of the points for understanding combat. First of all, you have to understand that to match the velocity, you need to burn towards the target half of the time, like 50% of the way. Then the other half the distance, you need to burn away from the target. Because you aren't doing this with a velocity, you're doing this with acceleration. When you accelerate towards the target, if you want to match it, if you want to match the target velocity, you need to then burn away from the target to slow yourself down, because you no longer slow yourself down. The same thing applies to the controls. I personally, the way I actually have a very unique system to help with pilot controls. On this white warship, which is meant to be a laser frigate, because, the frigate doesn't need to be big, it just needs to have light weaponry that can cover a lot of area. Because, frigates are mostly used for anti-piracy and just coastal defense and other minor things, which require lots of reach and very simple small craft. In this craft, you can see that I have gyros and servos on the inside, and they're set up so that whenever the warship moves, the gyros delay the movement on the inside by a little bit, so you can tell in what direction it's spinning, so it will automatically counter that rotation. Sadly, because of Trailmakers physics, this doesn't actually work, and half the time it gets stuck in a weird position and permanently breaks the thing. But it is what it is. And in this other one, which is more of a rocket skiff, an improvised combat ship, you'll see that it uses speed sensors layered all over it and some logic on the inside. The logic is there so that the speed sensors don't cut out the sideward speed and like the other directions. So it can still float in any direction for as long as it wants. These speed sensors will only detect and stop the rotation, not movement. These things combined with the auto strafing really effectively helps with managing the warship, but honestly, I say just get good with the rotations and don't have a system to assist you with it, because frankly, it can be a mess and they don't work well in Trailmakers. So yeah, the biggest difference if you're used to dogfighting, do not hold down any of the buttons. Learn to tap them, because again, you're dealing with acceleration in space, not velocity. If you burn too hard towards the target, and you forget to burn retrograde, which is to slow yourself down, you will shoot way past them and then go off into the moon and slam into an asteroid or something. It's just a bad time for everybody. But that's most of the combat done. As for the aesthetics, the first and foremost thing I want to say is there are many, many different ways to say, like, to show if something is a near future space warship. But I'm just going to go broadly over the more typical things. I'm going to link some videos in the description of some near future warship designs that you can consider looking at as reference points. The first thing that you'll notice is that almost all of them either look like tubes or cones. This is because the farther away that you get from the main drive, the exponentially more support that it needs. So for example, these little pylons on the skiff, they don't need much, but that's only because the amount of mass at the edges is very small. If you look towards the base, this section, it needs a lot more support to look like it's actually reasonable and not falling off. Now, the main limit that warships experience in space is heat management. And to deal with heat, there are a few ways to do so. On Earth, people can just use air cooling. The air can soak up a lot of heat, not very quickly, not very efficiently, but over time, things will generally cool off pretty fast. In space, that can't happen because there is no air. So the only way to get rid of heat is one of the following. So it's possible to dump the heat into the exhaust gases. So all the tiny RCS thrusters and so on, it's possible to shove the heat in there, and then when it's triggered, it'll blast out the gas and the heat will go away with it. However, this is very limited and cannot be done at large scales, which is why the second thing, the most common way that warships manage heat, is by using massive radiator panels, as you can see here. I find that this is a pretty effective way of putting them on warships and like making them look decent. But yeah, the point is of a radiator is to just have as much surface area as possible, so it's a very thin sheet, and then having all the heat run through it. So the heat goes through the radiator panel and then radiates out to space. Not through air cooling, rather because of the light it emits. And because it's emitting light, it's losing energy in the form of that light. The last thing to mention is that you can actually technically use the entire surface of the warship as a space to radiate heat off of. But more importantly, the whole surface of the warship should be as efficient at deflecting light as possible. Because when you're in deep space, getting blasted by the sun's rays is a pretty fast way to melt. Which is why almost every single warship is white, or at least a very, very light gray. This is because white and other such colors mean that it is reflecting light and not absorbing it, which is precisely what you want when you're considering heat management. And finally, there are the drives. The drives change a lot from ship to ship, but there are a couple general classifications. Ion drives are only for like really, really tiny warships, or like ships in general, so most people don't use them. Then you have your standard chemical thrusters, which is what we have here on Earth now. Nuclear-assisted thrusters, which is exactly what it sounds like, using the heat from a nuclear reactor to boost the performance of a normal chemical rocket. And then there's the Orion drive, which is basically dropping nukes behind you to blast yourself forward. Yes, it's as stupid as it sounds, but it is actually kind of efficient in some senses of the word. Most of these drives have a specific weight class that they're good in. For example, most chemical rockets are good in like more conventional sized warships. Chemical rockets are good in smaller sizes of warships, while nuclear assisted chemical rockets, I think they're called nuclear thermal rockets, tend to produce a lot more heat, and therefore they produce more thrust and more heat, which means that you would need more radiator panels with them, but they can also push a larger craft easier. Then there is the Orion drive, which requires even more radiators because it produces even more heat, but it can push, again, even bigger things. So this kind of concept of having different weight classes of ships matters a lot because the two things that mainly produce heat on a warship is one, the drive, and two, the other systems on that drive, on the warship. And both of those things take up the inside of that warship, whereas how much heat the warship can dump is based off of the surface area of the warship. Now, if any of you remember the square cube law from school, you'll also know that the inside volume of a shape will always scale much faster than the surface area of the shape. What this means is that the larger a warship is, the exponentially more of it needs to be a radiator. That's why I can get away with making these smaller ships at a more reasonable scale and only having these, again, relatively small radiators. Whereas if you're planning to build ships that that use the Orion drive, you'd instead look absolutely massive. And as a last note, for maneuvering, you probably to give that authentic look, and also because it looks very, very cool, I recommend just peppering the surface with as many mini thrusters as possible. Yes, it will be a pain to hook them all up, but trust me, having little flares of gases burst out of the side every once in a while for correction maneuvers, it just looks very cool. That, combined with thrust vectoring on the main drives, is typically all you need for very, very good authority over in what direction the warship is pointed. Now, again, I've linked a few videos in the description for examples of all of these, but warships can generally be very, very different depending on what form of quote-unquote realism you're going for. For example, some forms of realistic spacecraft shown in media completely skip out on the whole radiator and heat management problem. Others go incredibly heavy into that and are basically made of radiators. So you have to understand all these things are built on a sliding scale. But typically, if you add all the features that I've just stated, it will look roughly kind of like a near future warship made for space. However, how do you actually put all these details together? I've explained the many different aspects in making a realistic looking space warship, but how do you actually stick them together onto a creation? Personally, the method that I use for pretty much most of my creations is I start with the quote-unquote cool bits, the parts that I know will be on the creation no matter what. So for the skiff, what I did was I started with the engines, because that was, pretty critical and pretty important. Then I added the small little then I added like the minigun weapon stations, the little turrets, and then I also added the big rocket pods. Then after that, I just spaced them out so that they break up the shape so that it doesn't look like a boring cylinder. Instead, it looks kind of interesting. And then I just put it on. And then I just built the shell underneath all of that. I used a very similar method on the laser frigate, where I just made the laser systems, made the main drive, and decided that I wanted the middle relatively blank, and then put the sensor ball on the nose. And then again, I just built a slope to match all of that and to place all of that on. because what dictates the size of your warship should not be anything about realism, because this is still a building game. It should be about, does it still look interesting if I make the warship this big? Because a lot of the time, if you try to go too big, you end up with a lot of spots that just kind of look bland and with nothing on them. And that's about it. I am running out of ideas for my next video, so if you do have any suggestions, I am willing to take them. Please put them in the comments, because I don't have enough time to go back through all my past videos to look in the comments for those suggestions. But yeah, that's about it. Goodbye.